book. I mean, there are
Okay.
quite a few books on propaganda and the various the various evil forces around us. I say amusingly, but this one is remarkably researched. As you can see, it's not the thinnest book, but it's incredibly well researched, erudite, and sophisticated, and it's a very but it's at the same time a very enjoyable read. And we're delighted and honored to have you come in, especially after the personal trials and tribulations you've undergone, you've experienced, and some of which you recount in your book, actually, but we'll get to that. And so perhaps my first question to you is, what got you starting writing this book, and what, if you can tell us a bit more, but tell the audience rather a bit more about your initial experience and what you think perhaps is radically new in the current context.
Sure. So I wanted to write the book really as a through line. So I got interested in the topic of propaganda and influence as I guess you would call it an activist or just a normal person who got very involved in what I guess kind of describe in the book as a faction, a pro-vaccine faction that I wanted to start in 2013 in California politics. I wanted to influence California politics. And I specifically wanted to do it because we had a measles outbreak in Disneyland in 2014. Funny enough, now we have a measles outbreak in Texas, and 2 children have tragically died here in the United States of measles in 2025, which is a remarkable thing to say. In 2014, when it happened, I had a 1-year-old who had just kind of gotten his first shot. But I was doing that thing that you have to do in the States where you put your kid on a bunch of preschool waiting lists. And as I was doing that, I was searching for the vaccination rates because I had moved from New York to California, and the vaccine laws go state by state in the US. And in New York, they were much stricter because there was a religious exemption, but you had to prove that you had a sincerely held belief, and there was actually kind of a tribunal of sorts that evaluated whether that was true. You had to actually sort of submit letters and kind of document that this was not a thing that you had just made up. But in California, you could just write a letter, a personal belief exemption, they called it, where you could just opt out. And this meant that we had a measles outbreak in Disneyland in 2014. And I found this outrageous, candidly. And I called my congressman at the time. I lived in the city of San Francisco, and I said, is there anything that we can do about this? And he said, there's a senator pediatrician. Oh, sorry, I'm getting note that I'm hard to hear. Let me see what I can make sure this is no, I am on the right mic. Okay, I'll just stand closer to it. So I called my congressman and I said, is there anything we can do about this? And he said, well, there's this pediatrician up in Sacramento, another city in California, who's going to be introducing a bill. And, if she'd like to help out with it, we'd love to have some moms participating in the conversation on the pro-vaccine side. There are many, many anti-vaccine moms. There are not very many visible pro-vaccine moms. And ironically, the person who was leading the anti-vaccine moms was Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is now our Secretary of Health and Human Services 10 years later. So I was connected by the senator from Sacramento to a few other moms who had also called in with similar questions. And we decided we were going to start a Facebook group, and we called it Vaccinate California. And none of us had ever done such a thing before, but we decided that we were going to learn how to be online activists. And we realized that we were about 6 years behind the anti-vaccine movement. They had already done this process. They had already created Facebook groups, Facebook pages. They had very large audiences. They had many followers. They had been running ads for a very long time to grow their movement. And we had nothing. We were significantly behind. And so we started doing that process of trying to become influential online. And I'll spare the whole story because it actually kind of opens the book. But that process of realizing that, for me, I felt like this was the future, but it was also the present. Like I was doing the thing that everybody was going to have to do to be influential, to fight political war, to fight for public opinion going forward. And I wound up, we did get this law passed in California to eliminate the personal belief exemption and to improve vaccination rates in kindergarten. But what was most striking to me about it was that the institutions themselves, the CDC and others, did not really see the point of what we were doing. They thought it was nice to have, this grassroots band of plucky moms doing this thing. But when I said, where are you guys? Why aren't you in this conversation? Why aren't you participating? Where is public health? I made a lot of network graphs, a lot of network maps. My job was to be the kind of, data science analyst person. That's my background, kind of documenting how information was moving from platform to platform, what hashtags were working, where influence from a quantitative perspective, where it was going. And they said, well, these are just some people online. And when parents make vaccination decisions, they still ultimately trust their pediatrician. They still ultimately read the CDC website. And I thought, I don't think it's going to continue that way for very long, actually. That's not the sense that I'm getting from what I'm seeing here. Um, and so I got very interested in that question of how does influence work? Who has it? What does the sort of structures that move information today and the power that we've all been given, how does it operate? And what does modern propaganda look like? Because I felt like, misinformation came to be the term that described this for a long time. But misinformation, I feel, misses the role that a lot of this plays in people's lives, the value that it serves, the persuasiveness of it, the importance of participating in that faction, the role that participating serves for a lot of people. And I wanted to tell that story, to connect those dots and to explain what had happened, because many of the people that I encountered who were influential in very niche ways in 2014, 2015 became profoundly influential as COVID began to happen. And so I wanted to kind of connect the dots and explain to people how we had gotten here and what had happened and why institutions had really dropped the ball and missed this profound shift in influence.
Thanks a lot for that. Very lengthy, but setting the context, and especially what you and others detail very well, is how this anti-vax movement that has been going on for a while, pre-COVID, has then later set the stage for a smooth transition into the plandemic. So the scene was already set. But in a way, I mean, you yourself say that 80% of children are then vaccinated. Shouldn't we why should we care about perhaps 20% minority of people, trying to wreak havoc? Or is there something, or is there something more going on? And this is where you detail very nicely, this kind of the role of perception and the role of amplification and reach, as opposed to freedom of expression, freedom, the disproportionate reach.
So I would say two things. One, a lot of what I wanted to cover was the notion of what is the majority illusion, which at the time, I think the anti-vaccine movement in particular back then was small but highly visible in a way that the pro-vaccine movement was not. And that's because the passion is quite asymmetric, right? A simple way to put it is people don't wake up to tweet about round Earth, right? They don't wake up to weigh in on things that are considered common knowledge. There are beliefs that people hold that they just assume are the norm and the status quo. And as a result, there's not necessarily much of a galvanization around them. You see sometimes the rise of contrarian beliefs and opinions in some ways happens because people find them entertaining or distinct or interesting, or this is something somebody is saying a forbidden truth as opposed to expressing the status quo all over again. And so there is an appeal to it in some way. And this is where you see things that are held up as a brave truth teller challenging the establishment belief. And this actually happens with fairly astonishing frequency at this point. You'll actually see things that are, unfortunately, you see a rise in things like Holocaust denial, right? Or very long held truths that are now being relitigated in part because it attracts a significant amount of attention and it's seen as a way to challenge authority, challenge establishment, and reevaluate things that have been long held to be true. And this ties into a deep distrust in institutions and authorities and a desire to relitigate and reinterrogate what you might have learned. The other thing, though, that I'll point out, besides majority illusion and a desire to reevaluate things, is that again, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is now the United States Secretary of Health and Human Services. This is not a fringe figure. This is a man who controls health policy in the United States. So while many people in the United States will continue to vaccinate their children, while 50% of Americans look with horror at that appointment, that is a person who has an extraordinary amount of power to set research agendas, to set budgets, to decide who sits on boards, to decide, even in the case of, again, I mentioned 2 children who died of measles in Texas, what is the guidance that is given to impacted communities when the guidance is not go out and get yourself vaccinated immediately, MMR works and it is safe and effective, when the guidance is, well, you should probably do this. You could also consider these other options. When that is the guidance that is coming from the top public health official in the United States, that's alarming. And so this is not a fringe belief at all. This is a belief that sits in the halls of power now.
Thanks for that. Yeah, you mentioned something that is really at the core of your book is this kind of the dynamics at play, and you untangle them very well. I mean, especially two, the one that you call the trinity, this new system of persuasion between influencers, algorithms, and crowds, and especially how hyperpartisan medium jumps on something that's been written, sorry, on social media or platforms, and then that gets amplified, and then the crowds, contribute and so on. And something that I thought was fascinating because it brings together modern and less modern, sense that we think propaganda, which we consider a bit as an antiquated term, or the very 20th century. You describe the collision and the ping pong in between the rumor mill and the propaganda machine. These very, extremely old, perennial nearly concepts in human history, between top and bottom. And yes, could you tell us more about that and what makes them so, what makes these symbioses so powerful and so damaging?
Well, I wanted to return to perennial concepts because I felt like it's not a new problem in human history or cognition or information flows. It's just a manifestation in a different place. And the thing that I think that is new is the rise of the influencer. I think that is actually the thing that is remarkably different. That is the figure that emerges from the current information architecture. The influencer is a unique figure in that they are sorry, my do not disturb thing apparently wore itself out. Let me just turn that back on. So the thing that is unique about the influencer is that they emerge because social media gives people the capacity to create. So you can become a content creator, and if you are charismatic, if you are potentially attractive, if you are affable, if you are relatable, if you are a good storyteller, if you understand how the algorithm works, right? That's the relationship between the algorithm and the influencer. If you understand, you'll see people who will really spend an incredible amount of time zeroing in on, for example, their YouTube dashboard. If I make this thumbnail just a little bit different, does that improve my views? If I change my length, what does that do to my views? Right? So they're not only good at messaging and relatability and the sort of soft skills of communication, they're also very, very granularly attuned to what the algorithm rewards. So they're really attuned to the medium itself. And so you have this figure that then also has the capacity to monetize. And so their relationship with their audience is not only a relationship built on that degree of relatability, that is what often the audience keys off of, but also on the understanding of what they need to do to monetize that audience. So I really wanted to focus in on the influencer and on the relationship between these sort of, again, the sort of 3 legs of the stool or triad, if you will, because the crowd shapes the influencer's content in turn, right? The influencer has to remain attractive to the crowd. And so that's where you get the phenomenon of audience capture, where you'll see influencers shifting their content slightly in response to the crowd saying, hey, it'd be really great if you covered this. Hey, don't you think this thing is horrible? Hey, why haven't you weighed in on this topic? Why aren't you using your platform to talk about X, Y, or Z? Right. And so you'll see the influencer, though, becomes this figure that has oftentimes the reach of mass media while still appearing to be quite relatable. And one of the things that I found really interesting in communications literature or propaganda literature is the realization that people don't form opinions based on some what's called the hypodermic model, sometimes this sort of top-down zap where the media says something and your opinions magically change, right? Persuasion really moves through that sense of being in communication and in dialogue with friends. And the thing that I find so interesting about the influencer is that you're kind of getting both in one place. There was a really interesting profile of Hassan Piker in the New York Times this weekend. It was a little bit weird, I'm not gonna lie. It's sort of he's a lefty streamer, kind of a leftist political streamer, and it had screenshots of his stream chats. And one thing that's very interesting, particularly about streamers, is as they're doing their broadcast, as they're talking to their audience is talking back to them in real time. And so they're constantly responding to what's in the chat, constantly responding to what's in the stream. And if you've never seen or participated in one of these moments, if you tend to be of a generation where you sort of listen and consume the media passively, you don't see the extent to which that relationship building and that discourse is happening in real time. And I think that it's a very, very participatory model that's foundationally different from what came before.
Yes. No, thank you very much for that. You talk about something that's very interesting is you talk at length about moderation and the quandary of moderation, the fact that, if you don't moderate, then you just let, the flood of information, including lots of bots and trolling and terrible, terrible statements, smears, targeting, harassment, and so on. But however, if you do moderate platforms, governments, and so on, then you get accused of censorship and of working for tyranny and of trying to silence the truth tellers and yourself being part of a massive plot. It seems as though it's a bit of a no-win situation. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think, what's your expert opinion on how platforms have been moderating so far? What do you think the present / the future holds regarding moderation? And is it a no-win situation?
This is such a great question. I started writing about content moderation, I think, back in around 2017 or so for Wired. So I remember when I was doing the pro-vaccine fights in 2014, 2015 timeframe, we got harassed, we got doxxed. And I was kind of amazed at how little was moderated at the time. It was really very much the Wild West. But we were very small potatoes. Like, this was just sort of juvenile fighting. It didn't feel juvenile at the time. I will say that, people took pictures of my kids and sort of threw them up on the internet, and really the intent is to intimidate you, to harass you. And that was a very sort of unpleasant experience because it did make me realize the extent to which harassment is intended to chill speech, right? And so for me, the kind of connection there was the sort of perverse dynamic where harassment is actually intended to silence other people's speech, to drive them out of the conversation. And so that is why when you look at how platforms choose to make that trade-off between free expression and content moderation of harassment specifically, it's because oftentimes harassment is intended to chill the participation of somebody else. And that's where I think that it's not quite so easy a line as to say, your right to harass somebody out of a conversation is where the protected speech should be. And we do have, if you think about a public square, so to speak, in the real world, there are time, place, and manner restrictions, for example. There are guardrails around what is considered reasonable speech. You don't follow your neighbor around the public square screaming obscenities at them. You don't. That's not how we behave. We don't consider that to be
So,
good behavior. Like somebody will actually intercede at that point, right? Somebody will moderate you, if you will, in real life if you behave like that. So the sort of like expectation, how we port these behaviors, people don't expect a free for all in the real world. So on the harassment front, there is that trade off between your right to harass someone versus that person being able to participate in the environment. There's another thing, though, which is the other area of content moderation, which is the moderation of political content or mis and disinformation, which is the other area where the conversation comes up. And that is not related to harassment. That is content specific moderation. And that's where I think you can have a more nuanced discussion around what should and shouldn't be allowed, because that's much more based on viewpoint. And how should a platform treat divergent viewpoints? At what point is content harmful? At what point do you say this deserves to be, and for those who don't know, there are 3 moderation approaches in enforcement. There is remove, which means it gets taken down, reduce, which means they put a label or some context on it, or inform. My preference, even dating back to the vaccine fights of, a decade ago, has always been inform. And that's because I think when you take something down, particularly political or, political speech or even false or misleading information, you create forbidden knowledge. You create something that it has a backfire effect. People say like, well, they don't want you to know. You mentioned the pandemic video. They knew that that was going to get taken down. The maker of that video knew, and I write this case study in the book because I watched it happen. That video was shared something like, it had 8 million views, if I'm remembering correctly, before YouTube took it down. It was
then
the
it's evidence of
stupidest,
a further plot.
decision.
YouTube
Here,
is not you.
I'll give you another example, because I didn't study it at the time, despite the conspiracy theories, but I actually pulled up the lab leak moderation policy recently because I was curious about it, because we didn't work on it at SIO at the time. It was not related to anything we were doing. The lab leak policy was moderated. Facebook put it in place for 3 months. The World Health Organization complained about it in February of 2021. That was when they began to take down content related to the lab leak. They lifted it in May of 2021. And they did it when that news broke. The Biden various intelligence agencies released their differing views about whether or not it had actually come from a lab, and they lifted the policy. Interestingly, during that time, YouTube had never blocked the discussion of the lab leak, because for different platforms moderate in different ways. And so you see these different private companies trying to decide what in what moment to moderate or not. Meta made that decision to moderate the lab leak during that 3-month period because there was concern that it was leading to hate speech or violence against the Asian community. Did they do a good enough job making that causal link? I would argue that the answer was no. And I thought that at the time too. But it was one of these decisions where you see a platform take information, make a decision, get new information, make a different decision. And so I think the challenge that you have is that oftentimes these decisions feel very arbitrary, they're unevenly enforced, and they don't feel very fair. And so the challenge that you get is when you have a centrally moderated platform, how do you do it well? And you asked, is there a good way to do it? I mean, in a centrally moderated platform, I think the only thing that makes it feel fair is transparency and an appeals process. The other option is that you have increasingly platforms that are not centrally controlled, like Blue Sky, where you give users more control, and that's your other option. And then you have a different set of problems that go with that. But nobody likes moderation. And I think it's generally an issue of nobody likes it. Everybody feels it's unfair. The platforms do have a right to do it. They do it primarily for business motivation reasons, and and here we are.
Thanks for that. Now I have two questions which maybe perhaps have been consuming me, all my time reading your book. And actually, bizarrely enough, because this is a book about, social platforms, and it would be fair to say on some level, on a great level, that your book is about technology, but is it really, in a way, really about technology and
I think
AI?
it's about people.
You're preempting my question.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. But I mean, you talk about the erosion of public trust and insight in experts, institution, government officials, the elections, even the mainstream media, and you tell us that all of these systems have resulted in an erosion of trust. But I've been wondering, I wonder, is this more of a symptom than that is hiding a greater, a more fundamental cause, the fact that because there is no more trust in these institutions, this is, with the help of all of these systems, as efficiently as they work, this is the situation now. And that because there is this fertile ground, because there are these kernels of truth, because there is discontent and mistrust, and this form of crisis, then various narratives, various bespoke realities, and with people raging at pseudo events, that can take such a powerful shape today.
I think the answer is yes. I think it's not an either or. I think one feeds the other. Yeah, exactly. The erosion of trust happens in part because the institution does something that is subpar, right? And then people notice it, and then those people are particularly a lot of
Yeah.
the time people are incentivized to feed off of it, to present themselves often as an alternative to it, and then the cycle perpetuates itself. I've been very interested in even just the last, we had the presidential administration change. I think we're just approaching 100 days. It might even be this week. I'm starting to
Yes.
see some of maybe it's today, where I'm starting to see some of those stories beginning to form. Um, the I've been reading some very interesting commentary on right-leaning Substacks, like people who were sort of Trump supporters who kind of made their way into Trump camp. So not necessarily diehards, but who had kind of made their way in, who are disappointed. And what they're saying that I find very interesting is they're beginning to have this realization, and I kind of shared one of them in a Substack note, an essay that I really liked a lot, where this person has the realization that the sort of vibes machine of social media um, can only can only go so far, and that while you can you can complain about the institutions, you can complain, but then when you run the institutions and you're actually in charge, the vibes and the memes aren't the people who are good at that are not necessarily translating into making good policy and actually reforming government. That Doge the meme versus what is actually happening over there is not actually translating into governmental reform or good governance or things that they are happy with. And so you're starting to see the sort of disconnect play out. The realization that reality cannot actually be made to conform to the vibes is how this person put it, which in the book I sort of described it as like tornado reality, right? Eventually it destroys your house. It doesn't really care. You're confronted with the immovable object, if you will, with the sort of laws of nature hit you, and you can't sort of socially construct or trend your way out of it. And that I think is like watching that realization hit has been kind of this interesting moment, the realization that you are the institutions now. We are the media. Okay, that's great. You are the government now. You are in charge. Like, what happens next?
It's funny because, there seems to be indeed a limit to performativity. And much of what you too tell us in your book seems to comfort that, people are playing roles and people choose their identities in the narratives that they choose. And that's why I'm always a bit skeptical of, the idea that let's just inform people and let's fact check, because ultimately, sometimes people just want, they make their choices informed by their disappointments or personal experiences. But with pseudo events and with various realities, it feels a bit like like a play in which, you know, various leaders seem to be able to, you know, they're very happy to play the foils, but once reality hits, then, you know, the cycle may start all over again. My second question for you was about democracy. And something that you show very well in your book is how concepts of freedom, concepts of tyranny, freedom of speech, these core concepts, you know, even democracy, are weaponized, are a bit upended, they're very, very much used, in fact, to attack democracy, to delegitimize core institutions of democracy, government, elections, even. And and I've been wondering about what Karl Popper has told us about the paradox of tolerance, the fact that, you know, democracy dictates that it tolerates everything, but should there be limits to democracy and tolerance in face of repeated attempted assaults on it? And it seems as though, and I'm asking this only because we seem to have reached such an extreme, it seems even, you know, at the core of government, with a clear nihilistic, what strikes me as a clear nihilistic streak about people who do not care about facts or anything, but seem to want to tear things down. So, and are ready to intimidate and harass and threaten and destroy and so on. So, yes. You know, how do we react? How does democracy react to such an assault on democracy, sometimes by the very institution and legislators?
I think that's what we're asking ourselves here right now. I think that the question of people have been a bit alarmed in the States, I believe, at the separation of powers. Well, the legislative branch didn't really quite feel as separate as I think some of us thought it was going to be. I think people thought the Senate was going to show a bit more of a spine in some of, you know, the its appropriations power just sort of disappearing, right? The things that are traditionally, you know, it's right to set budgets, the ways in which things were dismantled that traditionally would have had to have been done by the legislature, just sort of done by fiat. I think we're seeing some questions about what is going to happen with defiance of court orders. We haven't quite hit that point yet, but that is something that is an incessant topic of conversation in the media here. I don't know how closely you all are following that there. I know that American politics looms large. The you know, that is the question, I think, as people look towards 2026 already. I wish I had an answer for that. I feel a little bit like um
It's okay if you don't, and
no.
in which case, so that we have a
Well,
bit.
I think we're, you know, it is the inadequacy of saying, like, here we are watching it happen again. I have spent a lot of time, and this isn't in the book, obviously. I just published it last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. I've spent a lot of time looking at the archives of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is a 30-year period in American history from 1938 to 1968 or so, right? And it was a time when show trials and blacklists and institutions really just preemptively capitulated in a lot of ways, as opposed to exerting themselves as centers of power in their own right. And I think trying to point people to that history and to remind them of the need for independent institutions to stand up and to serve as counterbalances and to display some courage. You know, we are seeing Harvard suing the administration now, which I think is a significant and important thing for it to do. Seeing some of the law firms do it, some of the people who were targeted with executive orders do it. I think it is actually very, very important to mount defenses and not to just allow these egregious overreaches to sort of trample on the democratic process. So
Yeah, because as as your own experience shows, and you know, institutions can and have been weaponized, and I was going to ask you as my final question before we open up the Q&A to tell us briefly about what happened to you in the Stanford, that brilliant institution you were heading, and you know, perhaps mention some of the solutions that you think about that you think would be helpful.
Yeah, so I do give an update to, the timing of book publication is such that it's almost like a year before, turning in the manuscript to what happens next. So Stanford Internet Observatory shut down June 4th, essentially, or was, I'm sorry, didn't have funding. My contract was cut. It was refocused on other things, but it hasn't really published anything since. And the so that happened on the 4th. The book came out on the 11th. That was a remarkable, you know, set of dramatic events ahead of a book tour. But no, I think, and I wrote a little bit of the update again in this article on the House Un-American Activities Committee, because one thing I will say is that the series of events that happened is that work that we did on the election in 2020, in which we made the very bold claim that it was a free and fair election. There was no there was no stolen election. We documented the big lie. Recently, the man, Chris Krebs, who was the head of DHS Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at that time, was targeted by President Trump in a recent presidential memorandum, which is kind of like a executive order light. For the he's being investigated. His security clearance was revoked, so were the security clearances of all of the other people at his company, Sentinel One, which he had to quit. He was, you know, he's being investigated for denying that the election was rigged. So we actually have an executive order in which the president of the United States is investigating somebody for denying that the 2020 election was rigged. The 2020 election was not rigged. And so we have this rather surreal event. And the work that we did in 2020, which also made the point that the 2020 election was not rigged, became the focus of a big investigation by the House Committee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, which was sort of the second coming of the House Un-American Activities Committee, which again existed to target people, to get their documents, to make accusations. And once you are accused, you cannot exonerate yourself. We were accused of censoring 22 million tweets, very specific number. When it was clear that we had in fact done no such thing, we did not get an apology. The goalposts just moved, and ridiculous reports were written alleging that we had committed other egregious violations. And we are, I personally and some of my colleagues are named personally. We're being sued in a couple different states by Stephen Miller, who's an advisor to the president under his America First legal lawsuit mill. The purpose of doing that is largely to tie you up in paperwork. I was sued in May of 2023. It is now essentially May of 2025, and we are just beginning to get to jurisdictional discovery, so the first round of discovery. So for about 2 years, that court case has, very, very slowly wound its way through the courts with a judge that they cherry picked. And the purpose of doing that is to make it so that you can't really talk about either your court case or what you did. So it has a chilling effect. And ironically, even as they accuse you of, being a government-funded censor who, collaborated with God knows who to steal the election or to, censor conservative speech or whatever, they have essentially silenced you and targeted you for exercising your First Amendment right to do academically, to exercise your academic freedom and do First Amendment protected research. So this came for us 2 years ago. So I've been writing about it and speaking about it since. I am at Georgetown now, which has been fantastic on the academic freedom and free speech front. Stanford has been wonderful about going through the process of fighting the legal fight. But one of the things that I think institutions really didn't understand 2 years ago, and again with Harvard, are only really beginning to realize now, is that caving and backing away and capitulating and giving a little bit here and a little bit there and not participating in the war for public opinion, not fighting the propaganda fight, in other words, just seeds the ground and seeds public opinion to the liars, essentially. And that's kind of where we are in this moment. And I think it's going to be coming for a whole lot more, unfortunately. American institutions, you're seeing the executive orders targeting various law firms, targeting various institutions, academic institutions, and the The way that it came for Columbia versus Harvard, the way that different institutions have responded has been really pretty profound. And I think that you're only now starting to see institutions realize that they have to fight back.
Thank you for that very, very, powerful response. Why don't we open the floor to questions, since we will have to be punctual today?
Okay, let's do that. So, yeah, there have been a number of questions. Thank you. Please keep sending them in. There's a question from Margaret, which could be potentially vast, but perhaps Renée could offer a condensed answer. It just says simply, could you discuss the role of algorithm design a bit more?
Oh,
I
yeah.
guess particularly in terms of how it may feed into some of the broader patterns that you've been discussing.
No, I love that question. There is a whole chapter just on that. And I try to make it as simple as possible. So the algorithm is a very, very, very huge oversimplification, obviously. There's a lot of different ways that algorithms come in, influence and shape our experience on social media. The number one way that I think is relevant to this conversation is how they curate information. So there's a few that are very, I guess, relevant. The first that I'll mention is what's called the people you may know algorithm. That's what Facebook called it. But that's how it suggests people who you might want to follow. So you've definitely seen this. It'll suggest a friend to you. Once you follow that friend, it'll sort of crawl the social graph and recommend other friends to you. That was actually how social media used to work. It was very concerned with finding you that graph, because the more people you were connected to, the more likely you were to want to stay on the platform. So as you followed more people, you would have a better experience. And the theory was you would want to stay on that social network, because every social network is competing against every other social network for your time. So even though Facebook maybe is showing you your friends, and Twitter or X is showing you text, and YouTube is showing you videos, they're all ultimately competing for your time, because if you're on one, you can't be on the other. And so let's talk about another aspect of curation, which is showing you something based on your interests. So recommended content. So a recommender system might work. There's kind of two main buckets. One will show you something based on things that you have engaged with before. So you like, gardening content, maybe it shows you more gardening content. It knows that this is a theme that you kind of want to stick with. And so this is an interest, you've pretty clearly telegraphed it, and it's kind of a sure thing. It's going to continue to show you more stuff from that theme. But another thing that it can do is it can say that you, based on your behaviors, based on where you live, maybe based on your demographics, based on what you've watched or liked or who you follow, it can kind of amass a picture of you as a person, right? As a user. And it can say that you are pretty similar to this other user over here. You don't even have to know each other. But what it says is that you're pretty similar to that person, and that person likes these other things. And so even though you maybe have never indicated an interest in those other things, it's worth it for it to show you that other thing. And that's because based on similarities, it's you're just kind of more likely to want to engage with that content. So it's showing you things based on kind of the aggregate overall behavior of other types of users or statistical similarities. So increasingly, what platforms like TikTok do is they're not necessarily showing you things based on who you've chosen to follow, but instead it's based on things that it thinks that you will find interesting. So it's just that sense of serendipity. And as TikTok has really came to really be a dominant force, as TikTok really grew and attracted particularly a younger user base, you started to see platforms like Meta compete with TikTok to show more of what's called unconnected content. So instead of seeing all those posts from your friends and family, it too is now showing you about 20 to 25% of the time unconnected content that it thinks serendipitously you just might like. So the reason curation matters is because this is the algorithm deciding what is going to be ranked at the top of your feed. So one of the reasons why there are such fierce fights about what is shown on social media is that if you have 5 minutes and you pull out your app to do your social media in that 5 minutes, those apps are all competing for the business use case, like to show you that ad. But all of those content creators, all of those influencers who also want to monetize, also want your attention, they're competing for your attention, right? So they're trying to produce something sensational and interesting to try to get that pride of place in the algorithmic ranking. And then all those politicians, right, want to make sure that their political party, their political content isn't being downranked. So, if Mark Zuckerberg is like, you know what, we're just not going to show much political content, well, maybe that really pisses off one party or another because they're like, no, 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 no. We want you showing our political content to people when they open your app. So that's where you start to see all of the competition and fighting from all of the different forces because they want your attention during that time when you're doing that scrolling on the app. And that's why algorithmic curation is such a fraught topic that people fight so much about.
That was a very clear and comprehensive answer. Thank you. Audrey, is there anything you want to follow up on, either with the original question or Renee's response?
No, it's fine, especially we don't have much time.
Okie dokes. Well, there's a couple of funny questions that may just lead to funny answers or may lead to kind of unexpectedly deep answers. So let's start with Fred's one. Since influences of all persuasions purvey an addictive product, can we apply the successful lessons of tobacco regulation, e.g., mandatory warnings, PSAs, and compulsory taxes, age restriction, to them? That seems like a kind of implausible idea in my head, but maybe you actually realize that this is where we're going to have to go or something like that.
Actually, you mentioned Naomi Oreskes in your book, don't you?
I do. I'm actually, I think I'm seeing her on Thursday, actually, up in Boston. There's a thing on this, and I'm kind of curious to hear her talk about it. The age restriction is the one that I think people are most interested in because, again, on the kids front, people do recognize that certain aspects of kids, particularly because some of these platforms like Instagram, I believe, allows 13-year-olds on it. And so they are trying to figure out what to do. The laws in the US and the UK are, there's some differences there. Australia has a youth online safety law. There's different areas, different laws. I know I'm most familiar with the sort of fights in the US. There are proactive capitulations some of the platforms will periodically try to make to avoid regulation, but I think that you will see regulation on the youth front, and that is because the evidence that even I saw some comments on AI a little bit lower. There's some court cases that are winding their way through about AI chatbots and their influence on kids also. So that would be the area where I think you're most likely to see it. The evidence of addiction specifically isn't very strong in the social science research. It's not quite the same mechanics as an actual addiction. So you see PSAs, but that's not something that they will regulate on for adults. Instead, it'll be more focused on kids online safety and harm.
Awesome. Okay, next sort of funny question. If we cannot persuade people with logic, reasons, and facts to combat misinformation and propaganda, then how can we outdumb or discredit these people to dismantle their bullshit? That's from BE.
Yeah, there's the
Central question.
no, there's the like what is it? Studies of rhetoric. How do you think about logic, reason, and facts is actually just sort of one small facet of like sort of the triangle of persuasion, right? You've also got emotion. You've also got ways in which like reason is just one small part of it. Who is the speaker? Is the speaker compelling? Is the speaker trusted? We were talking about trust. I spend some time in the book actually asking this question because, again, if you believe, as I do, that misinformation is a chronic state of the human experience, people have always been wrong, and propaganda. The reason, again, that I use that term as opposed to some of the sort of newer ones that social science has leveraged over the last decade. Um, if you go back to the 1930s, you actually see some really interesting counter propaganda or propaganda education efforts that the United States runs. And I imagine that they had them in the UK too. I'm, again, much more familiar with what the US did. Efforts like the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, where they try to teach people to recognize rhetoric. So they're not actually, so there was a Catholic priest, Father Coughlin, he was a radio influencer at a time when that was the new dominant medium. He had about, I think, 22 million listeners or so at a time when the US population was around 130 million people. He was sort of like FDR, who's a contemporary of FDR. And around the time FDR was doing his fireside chats, this radio priest was also had the same massively influential figure, and he became a fascist, right? He became a sort of Nazi sympathizer. Um, but as a Catholic priest, he really enjoyed this position of trust, this very legitimate man, not a crackpot. And so what you see is the rise of first you see the broadcaster. The broadcasters begin to try to do something about this. They actually have somebody come on right after his broadcast to fact check him. So that is one thing that they do, in fact, try to fact check him. And they have somebody come on and say, Father Coughlin lied to you about this. He got this wrong. He told you this story. This is not true, right? And they start to work their way through that. They start making him try to pre-clear his speeches. His followers lose their mind. This is censorship. It's almost an exact parallel to today. You can actually pull the New York Times coverage. They have the New York Times digitized archives, and you can read the stories where the Times is covering what do you do about the demagogue on the radio. Because FDR doesn't want to say kick him off the radio because that's censorship. The government doesn't want to intercede. And so then they have this group of people who starts annotating his speeches, not to fact check him, but to walk through what is the rhetoric that this person is using? Why is it so compelling? And instead of explaining the facts, they're leaving that up to the broadcaster. They're just walking through, like, when he says they are doing this, like, why does the word they stick out? What are the and they give these little it's actually really cute. I actually kind of printed a copy from the Internet Archive. They make these little emoji. They look just like our emoji. I was like, I didn't know they could do that back in the day, but they can. They make these little emoji, and they print his speeches, and they give each rhetorical technique a cute little name, like card stacking, sort of stacking the deck. And then they print a little playing card in the spot in the speech where the rhetorical technique appears, and they start handing these things out like pamphlets. And they give them out at the community centers, and they give them out in the high schools and the middle schools. And so it's like an entire lesson in rhetoric. And it's actually really interesting. And I find that when you teach people this stuff, it actually does become sticky, because then they feel empowered and they're like, oh, I recognize that. I see what he's doing there. And once you give people that skill, I think they actually feel like, oh, that's cool. I see that now. I didn't realize he was doing that, but now that I see it, I'm going to see it every single time. And I think that that is actually a really important thing that we could be doing, ways in which we taught people to recognize propaganda before. And I would actually very much like to see us doing it again.